Chapter 6, The First Omen, The Armadillo. Highway 8 is not a road designed for leisure. It is a utilitarian artery cut through the pine forests, intended for logging trucks, deer hunters, and people who are late for church. It is straight, flat, and flanked by ditches that are deep enough to hide a body or a very large tractor tire. We were 5 miles north of the junction, cruising at a steady 45 miles per hour. The general was scanning the shoulder of the road with the intensity of a hawk searching for a field mouse, or perhaps a tax auditor searching for a deduction. "Sector clear," he murmured. "Vegetation density, moderate. Threat level, low." "It's just pine trees, General, and the occasional possum," I said. "The possum is a neutral actor. He lacks the political ambition for espionage. It is the burrowers you must watch." Suddenly he flared his wings. He pecked the glass. "Halt!" I hit the brakes. The trailer jackknifed slightly, sending a shudder through the frame. Bronchi let out a sound of mild annoyance from the back. "What is it?" I asked, scanning the road. "Deer? Cop?" "Casualty," the general whispered. 3 o'clock, in the gravel." I pulled onto the shoulder. The gravel crunched under the tires. I put the truck in park and looked where the general was pointing. Lying on the side of the road, belly up to the sun, was a non-banded armadillo, Daspus novicinctus. He was quite dead. He had achieved that specific state of rigor mortis common to Arkansas roadkill, where the legs are stiff and pointing skyward, as if surrendering to a higher power. "It's an armadillo, General. He zigged when he should have zagged. It happens." The general hopped down from his perch. He looked at me with a mixture of grief and fury. "Do not speak of the fallen with such levity," he hissed. He demanded to disembark. I opened the door. The heat of the asphalt hit us like a physical blow. The general marched over to the corpse. He did not approach it like a scavenger. He approached it like a commanding officer visiting a battlefield. He walked a slow circle around the body. He inspected the claws. He inspected the shell. He looked at the tire tracks that had ended the creature's career. "Observe the armor," the general said, tapping the shell with his beak. "Plated, segmented. This is not a civilian. This is a sapper." "A what?" "A combat engineer," the general clarified, "sent by the resistance in Warren to undermine the supply lines of the tomato warlord. They dig tunnels under the hothouses. They destabilize the routes of the enemy." He looked north, his eyes narrowing. "He was likely carrying intelligence, maps of the irrigation grid, perhaps a list of the Tomato Queen's weaknesses." I looked at the armadillo. It looked like it had been carrying a distinct lack of traffic safety awareness. "General, he was hit by a Buick. It's not a conspiracy." "It is a targeted assassination," the general crowed, his voice cracking. "The tomato warlord fears the burrowers. He fears the truth from below." He turned to the truck. "Bronchi, Pig, attend me." I sighed. I lowered the ramp. Bronchi walked out, looking hot. Ochre refused to move, which was probably for the best, as a mourning pig on the side of a state highway tends to attract the sheriff. The general stood by the armadillo's head. He looked at me. "Full honors," he commanded. "We are not burying him, General. We don't have time, and the ground is like concrete. Then we shall perform the rite of the road." The general instructed me to retrieve the stick of poking, from the inventory. He had me place it across the armadillo's chest like a sword on the tomb of a crusader. Then he began the eulogy. It was a long, complex series of clucks, coos, and low-frequency rumbles. I don't speak fluent chicken, but the tone was unmistakable. He spoke of the armadillo's bravery. He spoke of the darkness of the tunnel. He spoke of the noble quest to chew the roots of the oppressor. Bronchi, caught up in the moment, lowered his head and let out a soft, mournful bray. It echoed off the pine trees, a sad, brassy note that felt strangely appropriate. A logging truck roared past, shaking the ground. The driver honked, a long, angry blast of air horn. The general didn't flinch. He stood his ground over the fallen sapper, staring down the 18-wheeler as if to dare it to challenge his grief. When the dust settled, the general hopped onto the armadillo's stomach. He looked north. "We shall avenge you, brother of the shell. Your digging was not in vain." He hopped down. He looked at me. "Recover the stick," he ordered. "We move out. The enemy is ruthless, and we have lost a valuable asset." I put the stick back in the truck. I loaded the donkey. I got back in the driver's seat. As we pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror. The armadillo was still there, legs pointing at the sky, holding his stick. "He looks peaceful," I said. "He looks like a warning," the general replied, gripping his perch. "Drive and watch the ditches. The war has begun." Chapter 7. The Fog at Milo. Geography, usually a reliable science, begins to fail around the community of Milo. Technically, we were still on Highway 8, heading northwest. The map claimed this was a standard asphalt corridor connecting the pine uplands to the river basin. But the map did not account for the air. As we descended from the ridges, the humidity did not just rise, it solidified. It ceased to be weather and became a curtain. The locals call it river breath, a dense saline exhalation that rolls off the bottoms and sits on the road, turning high beams into milky, useless tunnels of light. "Visibility is degrading," the general announced from his dashboard perch. He was leaning forward, his beak almost touching the glass. "Tactical obscuration. The tomato warlord has deployed smoke canisters." "It's fog, General," I said, slowing the truck to a crawl. "We're hitting the floodplain. The river is close." The fog was not white. It was the color of old parchment, thick and heavy with the smell of wet cypress and standing water. It muffled the sound of the tires. The rattling of the trailer behind us seemed to come from a great distance, as if the donkey and the pig were following me in a different decade. We passed the scattering of houses that constitutes Milo. Porch lights were on, but they looked like distant stars drowning in milk. "I don't like this sector," the general murmured. He fluffed his feathers, making himself look like a copper pine cone. "The frequencies are wrong. I'm picking up static." He wasn't wrong. The radio, which had been playing a steady stream of country gold, suddenly hissed. The signal for KSSN dissolved into a rhythmic crackle, like dry leaves being crushed underfoot. "Frequency C," I whispered to myself. "The thin places." Bronchi, in the trailer, let out a low bray. It wasn't a complaint. It was a greeting. Then I saw it. It appeared on the right side of the road, just past the drainage culvert where the water stands black and still. At first, I thought it was a deer. The eyes reflected the headlights with that familiar green-gold shine. But deer bolt, deer freeze, deer panic. This thing was pacing. It was a dog, or at least it held the shape of a dog. It was massive, standing nearly as tall as the hood of the truck. Its coat was not just white, it was luminous, radiating a soft, pale glow that seemed to push the fog back a few inches. It moved with a silent, fluid grace, trotting alongside the truck in the ditch, matching our speed perfectly. "Contact right," the general said. His voice was not angry. It was respectful. "The Guardian." I gripped the steering wheel. I knew the stories. Every family in the Saline River bottoms has a story about the white things. Sometimes it's a horse that vanishes when you try to saddle it. Sometimes it's a panther that screams like a woman. But the white dog is different. Legend says he patrols the trace, the old pass that existed before the asphalt. He doesn't hunt, he watches. He escorts travelers across the boundaries of reality, ensuring they don't wander off the map and into the ghost loops. "He's watching us," I said. "He is vetting us," the general corrected. "He is checking our papers. He wants to know if we are tourists or pilgrims." The ghost dog turned its head. Its eyes were cold and blue, burning through the fog. It looked directly at the general. The general did not scream. He did not posture. He simply raised one wing in a slow, solemn salute. The dog dipped its head in return. Then, as the road curved toward the bridge approach, the dog simply dissolved. It didn't run into the woods. It just became part of the fog, its luminescence fading into the general gray at a river bottom. The radio static cleared instantly. A commercial for a lawyer specializing in tractor accidents blared through the speakers. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. My hands were shaking slightly. "Was that?" I started. "The gatekeeper," the general finished. He settled back onto his perch, looking pleased. "We have been cleared for passage. The river accepts our commission." "Or he just decided we weren't worth eating," I muttered. "Cynicism is a civilian luxury," the general said. "Eyes front, the Rubicon is ahead." Ahead of us, the fog thinned just enough to reveal the steel truss of the Saline River Bridge. The water below was black, swollen, and moving with a heavy muscular silence. We had survived the descent. Now we had to cross.
Chapter 8. Arrival at the Bridge. The Highway 8 bridge over the Saline River is not a welcoming structure. It's a utilitarian cage of riveted steel and concrete, built in an era when engineers believed that the best way to conquer a river was to strangle it. It looms out of the bottomlands like the skeletal remains of a prehistoric beast that died trying to cross the water. The fog had thinned enough for us to see the truss work, but the water below remained a mystery. The Saline is the last free-flowing river in the Ouachita Basin. It does not have dams to regulate its mood. Today, it was swollen, moving with a muscular, coffee-colored violence that suggested it had digested a great deal of rainfall in Benton and was now rushing south to tell Louisiana about it. "The Rubicon," the general announced. He was standing on one leg on his dashboard perch, a posture of extreme tactical focus. "Once we cross, there is no turning back. The die is cast. The tomato is peeled." "That's not the saying, General," I said. "It is the saying of the victor," he countered. I eased the truck onto the bridge deck. The tires sang on the metal expansion joints, thump, 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 a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. The air temperature dropped 10 degrees instantly. We were suspended over the water now, caught in the threshold, that liminal space where the laws of Ashley County end and the laws of the river begin. The truck, which had been rattling with its usual mechanical complaints, suddenly went silent. The engine didn't die. The noise just stopped. The wind died. The tires stopped singing. In that silence, the radio turned on. This was technically impossible.
The radio in my F-150 had not worked since 2009 when a mud dauber nest shorted out the volume knob. It was a dead unit, a tombstone for AM frequencies. But the display lit up, a pale, sickly green light. Static washed through the cab, not the sharp hiss of electronic interference, but the soft, rolling crackle of a needle on old vinyl. Then a harmonica cut through the noise. It was raw, bluesy, and undeniably broadcast from a different decade. "Pass the biscuits, 'cause it's King Biscuit time." The voice was tinny, distant, bouncing off the ionosphere of 1941. It was the legendary broadcast from Helena, Arkansas, a show that had no business reaching a truck on a bridge in the Saline Bottoms. I gripped the wheel. "General, are you hearing this?" The general cocked his head. He did not look frightened. He looked validated. "Psychological operations," he murmured. "The ancients are broadcasting morale." The harmonica faded into a wash of white noise. And then, rising from the static, came a sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was a whistle, deeply resonant, mournful and wet. It was the call of a paddle wheeler, the hand ear, the Romeo, pushing upriver against a current that hadn't existed for 100 years. Whoo! It vibrated the dashboard. The yellow hard hat rattled. Bronchi, in the trailer, let out a bray that harmonized perfectly with the phantom boat. And then, just as the truck tires hit the asphalt on the western bank, the radio died. The green light faded. The engine noise returned with a jar and roar. The wind rushed back in through the windows. We were across. I pulled the truck onto the shoulder of the road, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked back at the bridge. It sat there, silent and still, looking completely innocent. "That wasn't a radio," I said, my voice shaky. "That was a ghost." The general preened a wing feather, looking utterly unbothered. "It was a signal," he corrected. "Naval support confirmed. The River Navy protects the flank." He looked at me, his eyes bright with the madness of command. "Proceed, driver. The spirits of the water have yielded. We are now in the fracture zone." I put the truck in gear. My hands were still sweating. I looked at the map. We were technically in Bradley County now, or close to it. The Ashley Path had officially begun. "Naval support," I muttered to myself, checking the rearview mirror. Right. But as we drove away from the river, I could have sworn I smelled it. Not just mud and pine, but the sharp, biting scent of coal smoke. Chapter 9. The Descent into Longview. We turned off the blacktop and onto a gravel trace that wound down toward the river like a scar. This was the road to Longview. In the daylight of a map, Longview is simply a coordinate, a boat ramp, and a few acres of saline natural area where people go to catch crappie and drink beer in peace. But at twilight, when the shadows stretch out of the cane like fingers, it remembers what it used to be. "Terrain assessment," the general whispered. He was no longer pacing. He was crouching low on his perch, his feathers pressed tight against his body. "The air is heavy. The frequency is vintage." "It's humidity, General," I said, though I didn't believe it. "We're dropping into the bottom." We were dropping into the fracture zone. The trees here were different. Massive, bald cypress and overcup oaks that looked like they'd been standing since the Louisiana Purchase. The air smelled of wet rot and something metallic, like old pennies or dried blood. I parked the truck in a clearing near the water. The river here was wide and black, sliding past the banks with a silence that felt enforced, as if the water had been told to keep its secrets. "We camp here," I announced. "We attack the Warren Road in the morning." The general hopped down.
He did not scratch the dirt. He stood perfectly still, listening. Bronchi unloaded himself. He walked straight to the water's edge and stood there staring at the empty air above the river. His ears swiveled back and forth, tracking a sound that I couldn't hear yet. "He hears the mules," the general said softly. "What mules?" "The logistical train," the general replied. "Can't you hear the chains?" I set up the camp stove. I opened a can of beans. I tried to ignore the fact that the sun was setting too fast, as if the horizon was eager to get the day over with. Night fell like a hammer, and then the ghost loop began. It didn't start with moans or rattling chains. It started with the sound of a winch, a rhythmic, mechanical creak, thud, echoing off the water. It was the sound of heavy timber being moved by men who were tired and scared. I dropped my spoon. "What is that?" "The engineering corps," the general said. He puffed his chest out. "Building the bridge." I looked at the river. There was nothing there but moonlight and drifting logs, but the sound was definitely real. I heard the splash of hooves, dozens of them, hitting the water. I heard the distinct, sharp crack of a whip. "March 1864, I whispered. I knew the history. This was the site of the skirmish at Longview. Colonel Powell Clayton and the Union cavalry had crossed here, burning the pontoon bridge behind them to cut off the Confederate pursuit. The air shimmered. For a second, the thin place tore open. I saw them. They weren't transparent. They looked like a photograph that was developing in the air. Men in blue wool, soaked to the bone, struggling with a floating bridge of flat-bottomed boats. I saw the steam rising from the flanks of the horses. I smelled the wet wool and the black powder. "The reinforcements," the general crowed. He lost his mind. He believed with every fiber of his delusional heart that this was his army. He believed that Tomato Warlord had sent troops, or perhaps he had summoned the Union Navy himself. He ran toward the riverbank. He flapped his wings, jumping onto a cypress knee. "Form ranks," he screamed. "The general is present. Secure the perimeter." He crowed. It was a magnificent, ear-splitting sound that should have woken the dead. But the dead were busy. The soldiers didn't look at him. A cavalryman on a bay mare rode right through the spot where the general was standing. The horse didn't spook. The general was buffeted by a wind that didn't exist, his feathers ruffled by the passage of a ghost. "Attend me," the general shrieked, hopping frantically. "I am your commander. Look at me. I have the pin." He thrust his chest out, displaying the plastic Big Chief pin in the moonlight. Nothing. The soldiers continued their grim work. They were setting fire to the bridge now. I heard the whoosh of oil catching, saw the phantom flames lick the water. The general stood there screaming orders at history, and history ignored him completely. He was invisible. He was a rooster standing in the echo of a war that had ended 160 years ago, trying to command men who couldn't see him because he didn't exist in their frequency. He was the most tragic thing I'd ever seen. Bronchi let out a low, mournful sound. He walked over to the general and nudged him gently with his nose. The vision faded. The fire died. The winch stopped. The river was just a river again, black and silent. The general stood on the cypress knee, panting. He looked at his wings. He looked at the empty water. He looked small. They did not have their radios on, the general whispered. His voice was shaken. "Communications failure." "Yeah, General," I said softly, walking over to pick him up. "Their comms were down. Let's get back to the truck." I carried him back to the cab. He didn't fight me. He sat on the dashboard, staring out at the dark, clutching his pen. He had seen the apex, an army of thousands, and realized that to them, he was nothing. We slept in the cab that night. I locked the doors, not because I was afraid of the ghosts,
but because I was afraid the general might try to swim after him.
Chapter 10. The Mussel Oracle. Morning at Longview Landing did not break. It leaked. The sun oozed through the cypress canopy like a yolk from a cracked egg, pale and runny, offering light but very little heat. The general was already awake. He was perched on the hood of the truck, preening a tail feather that had been ruffled by the phantom cavalry charge the night before. He looked tired but resolute, like a general who has realized his radio is broken, but decides to shout louder anyway. "The Spectral Division has withdrawn," he announced as I crawled out of the cab. "They operate on a nocturnal cycle, likely a union contract." I rubbed my neck. Sleeping in a Ford 115 is technically possible, but it leaves one with the spinal alignment of a question mark. "We need to move, General. This place, the air is too thick." Bronchi was already up. He was standing knee-deep in the shallows of the Saline, his ears swiveling back and forth. He wasn't drinking. He was staring at the water with intense fascination. "The donkey has found something," the general noted. "Asset recovery in progress." We walked down to the water's edge. Bronchi was nudging a dark oval shape in the mud with his nose. He was a mussel, a big one. The shell was dark brown and striated, half buried in the silt. "A clam," I said. "Great. Breakfast." "Do not touch it!" The voice came from the canebrake, sharp, nasal, and terrified. A man exploded from the vegetation. He was wearing chest waders, a fishing vest with too many pockets, and a pair of spectacles that were held together with duct tape and hope. He held a pair of digital calipers in one hand and a waterproof notebook in the other. This was Harlan Wicks. In Ashley County, Wicks is known as the Waterman. Some say he used to work for the Corps of Engineers until he was fired for writing a report claiming the Mississippi River was depressed. Others say he's a genius who just forgot to stop calculating things. He rushed past me, ignored the rooster, and waded straight to the donkey. He gently pushed Bronchi's nose away. "Standard deviations! You are altering the standard deviations! Do not disturb the array!" He knelt down in the mud, water sloshing over his waders, and applied the calipers to the mussel. He squinted at the digital readout. 104 millimeters, variance of .03. The compression is holding. He looked up at me. His eyes were wide and magnified by his glasses. "You almost crashed the system," he said accusatorily. "This is an Arkansas fat mucket, Lampsilis powelli. It is not a clam. It is a biological hard drive." The general, sensing a fellow technocrat, hopped down from the truck hood and approached the water's edge. "Identify yourself and state your clearance level," the general clucked. Wicks looked at the rooster. He didn't blink. He didn't ask why the chicken was talking or why I was letting it. In Wicks's world, a talking rooster was statistically improbable, but not impossible, provided the localized probability field was sufficiently distorted. Harlan Wicks, hydrotemporal engineer, freelance. I am monitoring the flow reversal. "The flow reversal?" I asked. "The river looks like it's flowing south to me." Wicks stood up, dripping mud. He tapped his notebook. "That is a visual illusion caused by gravity," he said dismissively. "Physically, yes, the water is moving south toward the Felsenthal. But narratively, the current has reversed. The narrative weight of 1864 is heavier than 2024. The river is trying to flow back to the war." He pointed at the mussel. "These fat muckets are filter feeders. But they don't just filter algae. They filter time. They absorb the memory of the water.
When the river gets too heavy with history, the muscles clamp shut to preserve the timeline. If they open, he trailed off, looking terrified. If they open, the general pressed, do we get pearls? No, he whispered, we get the skirmish, permanently. If the array fails, the timeline liquefies. You won't just see the ghosts, General. You will be the ghosts. You'll be trapped in a loop of pontoon bridges and dysentery. Forever. The general shuddered. Dysentery is bad for morale. Wicks looked at his calipers again. The reading is stable for now, but there is a massive disturbance upstream, a blockage. Something is preventing the modern era from flowing down here. The tomato warlord, the general declared. He has dammed the river of time. Wicks considered this. A tomato blockage, theoretically possible if the fruit density is high enough, but my data suggests a geological fault, specifically the fault at Gee's Landing. He pointed north up the gravel road we intended to travel. You are heading into the liquefaction zone, Wicks warned me. The sand blows are active. The ground is not ground up there. It is a fluid state. If you drive that truck through Gee's Landing, you must maintain a velocity of exactly 33 miles per hour. Why 33? I asked. Because, Wicks said, cleaning his glasses on a muddy sleeve. That is the resonant frequency of a 1994 Ford F-115. Any slower, you sink into the past. Any faster, you might skip straight to the heat death of the universe. He looked at Bronchi. And keep the donkey away from the muscles. His hoofs are magnetic. They are made of keratin, Mr. Wicks, I said. Everything is magnetic if the polarity of the tragedy is high enough, Wicks shouted. He turned back to the river, muttering about calcium carbonate memory storage. The general looked at me. He looked at Wicks. I like him, the general decided. He understands the gravity of the situation. We shall adopt his speed limit. I looked at Wicks, who was now measuring a different muscle and arguing with a crayfish. 33 miles per hour, I muttered. Through a sand blow? Right. I loaded the general, I loaded Bronchi, and as I started the truck, I looked back at the river. Wicks was gone, vanished back into the cane, presumably to calibrate a turtle. But the river, for a second, just a second, I saw the water ripple upstream, against the current, as if the mud was trying to crawl back to where it came from. I put the truck in gear. 33, I said, not 32, not 34. The general nodded. Steady as she goes, driver. The fat muckets are watching. Chapter 11. The Fault at Gee's Landing. We left the river bottoms and began the climb toward Gee's Landing, maintaining a strict velocity of 33 miles per hour. Driving a 1994 Ford F-150 at exactly 33 miles per hour is a challenge. It's the mechanical equivalent of trying to hum a C-sharp while sneezing. The truck wants to go 40 or it wants to die. It does not like compromise. Hold the line, driver, the general coached from the dashboard. Deviation detected. You were drifting to 34. Do not provoke the timeline. I'm trying, General. The throttle return spring is sticky. The road to Gee's Landing is not so much a road as a suggestion made by the county in 1960 and largely ignored by the earth ever since. It sits directly atop the Saline River Fault Zone, a geological grievance that has been active since the Eocene epoch. Harlan Wicks had warned us about liquefaction. I assumed this meant mud. I was wrong. We rounded a curve near a stand of scrub oak, and the road simply changed. The gravel disappeared. The dirt turned white. We hit a patch of sand, fine, silty, and impossibly deep. It was a sand blow, a geological pimple where the pressurized earth had burped up the ancient seafloor. The tires didn't skid, they sank. The tires spun, the engine roared, we dropped 6 inches instantly, the speedometer dropped from 33 to 0. "Velocity failure," the general shrieked. "We have stalled in the flux." The engine sputtered and died. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and wrong. I opened the door and stepped out. The ground didn't feel like Arkansas dirt. It felt spongy. The air was hot, not the wet, heavy heat of the swamp, but a dry, scorching heat that smelled of ozone and hot iron. The landscape flickered. That is the only word for it. It was like a film projector struggling with a bad splice. Flicker. The pine trees vanished. In their place stood massive, fern-like cycads, 30 feet tall, their fronds motionless in the stagnant air. A dragonfly the size of a ceiling fan buzzed past the truck, its wings making a sound like a distant helicopter. Triassic sector, vegetation density high, insect threat extreme. Flicker. The ferns vanished. The sun bleached white. Suddenly the land was desolate. Stumps, thousands of them, stretched to the horizon. The ground was scorched. Smoke hung in the air. I heard the phantom ring of an axe and the shout of a man cursing a mule. 1920, I whispered. The clear cut. Flicker. Ferns again. A lizard scuttled under the truck. Flicker. Stumps. A rusted steam donkey engine sat in the weeds, hissing. We were trapped in the fault line, bouncing between the time before man and the time after the devastation. The worn path had led us into a skip in the record. "We have to move," I said, grabbing the door handle. "The tires have no purchase. The sand is liquid." He was right. The sand blow was churning, bubbling up around the axles. Then the trailer ramp slammed down. Bronchi walked out. He stepped into the flickering reality with total indifference. He was wearing his red bandana, which looked shockingly bright against the prehistoric ferns in the sepia-toned stumps. He walked to the front of the truck. He looked at the sand blow. Flicker. A dinosaur roared in the distance. Bronchi chewed his cud. Flicker. A steam whistle blew. Bronchi twitched an ear. The donkey lowered his head. He found a patch of grass that seemed to exist in both realities, a stubborn, timeless clump of fescue. He took a bite. He chewed. He looked at the general through the windshield. He let out a sigh, a long, dusty exhalation that seemed to ground the whole universe. "Hey," Bronchi said, or he braided, but the meaning was clear. He turned around, presented his rear to the truck, and kicked the bumper. Thud. The impact shook the chassis. The flicker stopped. The sun slid back to 3 o'clock. The ferns dissolved. The stumps faded. The pine trees returned. The giant dragonfly shrank back to a horsefly. The sand under the tires hardened. He rebooted the timeline," the general whispered, awestruck. "The beast has reset the server." I didn't ask questions. I turned the key. The Ford started on the first try. I threw it into reverse, the tires grabbed the gravel, and we backed out of the sand blow. Bronchi finished his grass, walked back to the trailer, and loaded himself. I sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel, my heart racing. 33, I said. "We stick to 33. "Agreed," the general said, preening a feather that had briefly turned into a scale. "And remind me to promote the donkey. He has a firm grasp on the metaphysics."
Chapter 12. The Peppered Shiner's Warning. We cleared the time slip at Gee's Landing, but the truck was still vibrating. It wasn't a mechanical shimmy, it was a metaphysical one. the kind you get when your chassis has briefly existed in the Triassic period. We continued north, or what passed for north, on a road that seemed to be actively discouraged by the vegetation. The landscape had shifted again. We were out of the sand blow and into the backwater bottoms near Horsehead Creek. The air was thick, heavy, and smelled of stagnant water and chlorophyll. "Pull over," the general commanded. "We are making good time, General. The speedometer is holding at 33. "It is not a request," he snapped. "I'm receiving a hydrosonic transmission. The fleet is hailing us." I looked at the map. There was a blue squiggle marked Horsehead Creek. I sighed and pulled onto a patch of muddy grass near a stagnant pool of water that had been cut off from the main channel. The general hopped out immediately. He marched to the edge of the pool. The water was dark, still, and covered in a film of green algae that looked like bad guacamole. "General," I said, leaning against the fender, "this isn't the fleet. This is a mosquito breeding facility." "Silence, civilian," he hissed. "The peppered shiner speaks only to those with the clearance." He leaned over the water, his beak inches from the surface. He began to make a series of low, bubbling clucks, a sound I'd never heard before. It sounded like someone blowing bubbles in a milkshake. Bloop, bloop, grrr, bloop. I watched, expecting nothing but a mosquito bite. Then the water rippled. A tiny fish, no longer than my pinky finger, rose to the surface. It was pale, almost translucent, with tiny black speckles along its sides. It was a peppered shiner, Natropus purpallidus, a fish so rare that the Game and Fish Commission usually denies it exists just to keep people from looking for it. The fish did not swim away. It held its position in the water, staring up at the rooster. The general nodded. He turned his head to the side, listening. The fish blew a bubble. Pop! The general gasped. Another bubble. Pop! "My God," the general whispered, "the treachery!" "General," I called out, "you are conversing with a minnow." He turned to me, his eyes wide with horror. "This is not a minnow. This is a courier. He brings news from the upper saline. The tomato warlord has deployed a chemical agent." "Chemical agent?" "The plume," the general shouted. "The shiner says a toxic plume is moving south. It's still in the oxygen. It's turning the water to vinegar." He looked back at the fish. "Confirm vector," he clucked. The fish swam in a tight circle, then darted toward a submerged log. The general stood up, trembling. "It is worse than I thought," he said. "The enemy is not just attacking our culture, he's attacking our respiration." I walked over to the pool. I looked closer. The general was delusional, yes, but he wasn't wrong about the water. Near the bank, floating belly up in the weeds, were 3 bream and a small gar. Their gills were pale. The water didn't just smell stagnant, it smelled of sulfur and runoff. A distinct chemical sheen, like oil mixed with dish soap, swirled on the surface. "Low dissolved oxygen," I murmured, "or agricultural runoff from the tomato fields up north." Frequency A, reality, and frequency B, mythic, had collided. The general heard a fish warning him of a toxic plume. I saw a fish kill caused by fertilizer runoff. We were looking at the same tragedy through different lenses. "The shiner warns us," the general said solemnly. "If we cross the creek, we must not drink. We must not touch. The water is compromised." He looked at Bronchi, who had wandered over to sniff the algae.
"Negatory!" the general shrieked. "Abort hydration! The well is poisoned!" Bronchi froze. He looked at the water. He snorted, backed away, and rubbed his nose on his leg. The general turned back to the tiny speckled fish. He bowed. "Your intelligence is noted, Agent Shiner. Swim deep. Find the cold springs. The army of the chicken proceeds to the source." The fish flicked its tail and vanished into the murk. The general walked back to the truck. He looked grim. He looked like a leader who had just learned that the enemy has no rules. "We are not fighting a vegetable anymore," he said quietly as I lifted him onto the dashboard. "We are fighting a poison." I looked at the dead bream floating in the scum. I thought about the pink tomato festival fertilizers washing into the watershed. "You might be right, General. For once, you might be absolutely right." We pulled back onto the road. The air felt heavier now. The Warren Path wasn't just a trip through history anymore. It was a drive into a crime scene.